Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 30th, 2024. Well, thanks to the National Security Archives of George Washington University, we now can put together a much clearer picture of the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. Carter passed away yesterday at 100 years old, and the archives released some material directly related to the Brzezinski-Carter relationship. Brzezinski, of course, was a hardline Russia hater, and he was at the center of a dossier that we compiled, the LaRouche Organization compiled, under the direction of Lyndon LaRouche, titled Carter and the Party of International Terrorism, the so-called PIT brief for short. And what we can say today that we actually knew in real time, thanks to the prescience of Lyndon LaRouche, is that much of what is wrong with U.S. foreign policy today can be traced back to three things. First, the Nixon decision on August 15, 1971, to end the Bretton Woods Agreement and to remove the gold reserve backing of the dollar. Two, the role of Henry Kissinger, an admitted British agent of influence working for Chatham House as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State to Nixon. And three, the 4 years of Brzezinski as National Security Advisor. Now, Brzezinski's view of what to do in the Cold War included a geopolitical strategy to break apart the Soviet Union. This was classic British imperial geopolitics, going back to Mackinder. The idea that there cannot be allowed to exist a rival to the West in Eurasia, which he stated explicitly in his Grand Chessboard book in 1997. But this was his policy all along. It was a revival of the great game of the British countering the Russian Empire in Afghanistan in the middle of the 19th century. Brzezinski updated it through applying the ideas of Bernard Lewis, the British Arabist, to develop what was called the Islamic card and the Arc of Crisis. Now, this was applied in Afghanistan, where Brzezinski lured the Soviet Union into Afghanistan to put down an uprising against the pro-Soviet government there. And while there, that Brzezinski immediately, and that was, by the way, in December 1979, Brzezinski had already been involved in deploying the CIA to arm and train tribalists and jihadists to fight against the Soviet Union. And these networks later morphed into ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Now, thanks to the Digital National Security Archive of George Washington University, we have a clear view of Brzezinski's approach to diplomacy. Remember, Brzezinski was the mentor of Madeleine Albright, whose proteges include Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. They operate in the Brzezinski tradition, and that's why the Biden administration has been committed to this war in Ukraine against Russia. And let me give you one example from Brzezinski's National Security Council weekly report from April 21st, 1978. He starts by talking about the need to toughen policy, not just, quote, negotiating agreements and devising formulas, unquote. He said, we must adopt a hard-nosed effort, quote, to influence attitudes and to shape political events, unquote. Among his proposed tactics, the use of, quote, demonstrations of force to infuse fear, unquote. This included, quote, saying publicly one thing and quietly negotiating something else, unquote. Carter's note on this was handwritten. It said, lying, question mark. And of course, this was the policy, especially with the eastward expansion of NATO. The same archives from George Washington University extensively document how under Bill Clinton, there were two approaches. One was to promise the Russians that they would have an eventual path to membership in NATO, even while expanding eastward, including Ukraine and Georgia. Brzezinski went on to say we should use black propaganda to stimulate difficulties for our opponents. And he concluded this weekly report with the following statement. And just listen to this. This gives you a sense of the evil intent of U.S. policy at that time under Brzezinski. He wrote, quote, "The world is just too complicated and turbulent to be handled effectively by negotiating contracts, while neglecting the need also to manipulate, to influence, and to compel," unquote. That's it in a nutshell. To instill fear, to maintain the supremacy of the United States through military and other related operations. Now, just one additional note on Kissinger. In one of these memos, Carter wrote by hand, "H.K., Henry Kissinger, is a liar and also irresponsible. We must prepare to tell the truth about him," unquote. Unfortunately, they never did. And so the Kissinger-Brzezinski tandem of British geopolitical deployments put the United States into the position where the neocons under George H.W. Bush formed the basis of an American empire, the sole hegemon that we are stuck with today, the so-called unipolar order, or what Blinken calls the rules-based order, which is based on these precepts that Brzezinski practiced: lying, cheating, and using force. Now, you can check this out yourself if you want. You go to George Washington University Digital Archive, and they have posted today, Jimmy Carter, a Declassified Obituary. And these are events of nearly 50 years ago. But they show why there's a fear in the old boys network, in the establishment, of what would happen if Tulsi Gabbard is confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence. She's not part of the old boys network. There may be some problems with her, but we can see from her stands on the opposition to the U.S. role in the dirty war in Syria, her opposition to the war in Ukraine, as well as her commitment to honesty and truthfulness, that perhaps she would not go along with these kinds of policies and not only stop the continuation of these policies, but expose the operations over the period since John F. Kennedy's assassination that have put the United States on the wrong course of history. And the main concern expressed by her opponents is that she could not be trusted to maintain the so-called special relationship with Britain, the so-called Five Eyes Agreement, and therefore the United States might be susceptible to a national security approach, which is not that of the global cartels and the globalist financial institutions, insurance companies, cartels, the BlackRocks, and others, which would mean that the United States would not be engaged in permanent wars, permanent unleashing of chaos, color revolutions, and so on. So we go back to what Ronald Reagan said about security, which is you trust but verify. But how do you verify? How do you achieve truth when the fact checkers work for the unipolar order? And that's the legacy of Brzezinski. And that's what has to be changed today. And I would urge people to subscribe to the Executive Intelligence Review, keeping in mind that Lyndon LaRouche understood this about Brzezinski in real time back in 1977. Had people listened to LaRouche then, we could have avoided a half century of wars, of wasted tax dollars, and we could be sitting today in a totally different world situation. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.